Welcome to the herd and thanks for listening. If you enjoy this sodcast, please like it, share it, give it a good rating, and follow, and help more people find their way into the Ruminati herd. If you have suggestions for improvements, please let me know. Howdy, everybody. Welcome to this episode of the Meet Your Herdmates sodcast. I am very pleased to be joined today, Dr. Joe Bouton. Welcome.
You, Peter. Glad to be here.
Yeah, glad to be anywhere these days.
Exactly.
Although you're back in Athens, not like it's a recent thing, but we first met when you were in Athens, and then you moved away and did some other things and came back. And I've only occasionally gotten back to Athens since then. And the first time I visited, they had taken the road out in front of the Miller Plant Sciences building. It was gone.
Right. And the greenhouses up above and everything.
I'm lost, but you don't do that.
And they, even worse for people on campus, they took away about 50, 60 parking places. So that was really bad. More than that, maybe 100 parking places.
Yeah. I guess that's progress.
I guess it
is. For people not from the forage side of the Ruminati herd, Dr. Bouton has been a forage breeder who contributed with what does it say on your bio? How many? 27 forage and bioenergy cultivars and 11 cultivars currently in commercial production. What's a cultivar?
Well, it's a variety. It's just a cultivated variety. So an old botanical variety is really an old botanical term. It just meant, something you'd bring out of nature and just start propagating it and using it. Where a cultivated variety was usually improved through, well, the way breeders look at it, it's improved through genetic means or whatever. It added traits to it, and then it's cultivated, actually grown through seed or propagation through vegetative means. Yeah.
So would an egotype versus a cultivar, is that accurate?
I think an egotype is, to me, is something right out of nature, or it's maybe been exposed to natural selection, but not artificial selection. Yeah.
So there are germplasm repositories that would have accessions, and those would be ecotypes.
And so a lot of these terms could be interchangeable, but for me as a plant breeder, if I could collect a certain forage species in nature, and it's just out there, in a pasture or in a fence row or wherever, and I take that plant out, it's an ecotype to me. It's the type to that ecology, to that environment that it's sitting in right there.
Well, fair enough. Already I've jumped way ahead. So
there you go. And I probably gave you the old professorial run around on that too.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chips.
Yeah, I got a great story on Mr. Chips.
Yeah.
My grandparents were they were just old farmers, and when I told them I was going to be a professor at the university, the only concept they had of a professor was Mr. Chips. So as far as they were concerned, I walked around with a robe and mortar board. And I tried to explain to them about agriculture research, and there was actually a big experiment station at Stoneville, Mississippi, that they knew about, and they do research, and they kind of got that concept. But finally, I just told them, yeah, that's what I do. I walk around with a robe and a mortar board, and they were happy, and everybody was happy.
Yeah. So if you and Mary Jean got to go to dinner parties, remember when we did that?
Right.
And somebody didn't know who Joe Bouton was, how briefly would you introduce yourself?
Well, there are two ways I would introduce myself. If I use my wife's introduction, if somebody asked her what your husband does, she'd say he's a grass man. Now that would leave wide open with old hippies. That would leave wide open a lot of things. And my daughter, when she was little, she told somebody asked her what I did, and she said, he's a doctor, but he can't help you. So So I'm a grass man. I'm a doctoral grass man who can't help you.
Yes. Fair
So,
enough.
but really, it's the simplest thing is to just tell them I work with grasses and legumes, and or simply just say I work to feed animals, in pasture situations. Yeah, hay and pasture and stuff like that. They seem to grasp that fairly. I mean, they have a general concept of it.
Mm.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's fair to say that, you did all right for a boy from Washington County, right? Mississippi.
Yeah, there's a great song, kind of an old country, not country, but it comes out of the North Carolina mountains, and it was about uh, Ginseng Sullivan was the name of the song, and this
Oh,
guy collected ginseng,
mhm.
but he was from the Mississippi Delta, like I was, and the song's lyrics, the main lyrics say, "It's a long way from the North Georgia mountains to the Mississippi Delta."
Yes,
That
yes.
muddy water Mississippi Delta. Yeah. So yeah, that's pretty much that song. Says it all. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
it's a long way.
Well, congratulations, and also the opportunities that were available.
Yeah, it's true.
And I think at one point your father said something about I don't plan to come back.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of serendipity in life and luck, and chance. And when I was finishing at Mississippi State in my bachelor's degree and about to get married, my father, well, the chance event was cotton was 22 cents a pound, somewhere in that range. Well, he just told me, look, at that price, don't think about coming back and farming cotton. He said, I can barely keep my head above water with my 500 or 600 acres here, and I can't be sharing it with another family, so you need to do something different. And it was just another chance event that my main advisor at Mississippi State was a guy named Coleman Ward, who Coleman was big. He had studied under Roy Blazer, and he was running the turf and forage plots. And, he, I had worked for him as a student worker, and I told him I was interested in breeding for many reasons, going back even into my time at the Stoneville Experiment Station in Washington County, and worked for a cotton breeder. And I thought I thought that was great. And I had taken genetics at Mississippi State under a really dynamic guy, and I really liked it. So I just decided that I would go to graduate school in breeding, forage breeding. It just, it's just out of the blue. I think people have probably moved down career paths for sillier reasons, but that just seemed, that was just kind of like, what's in a 22-year-old's mind. Well, I like breeding. I work for a forage guy. I think I'll just go into forage and turf breeding.
Yeah. So that would be in the 70s.
Yeah, early 70s, around 1970, 71, 72.
Okay. And um, so there's a thought that I have of referring to you as the Gregor Mendel of forages, but that's perhaps a bit over the top.
Yeah, well, especially on impact. Especially on impact factor. I might have a few hundred publications, but he only had one, and this impact factor dwarfs all 100 put together.
But if anybody knows anything about plant breeding, maybe they know that, and they think of flowers and being able to, but grasses don't have a flower like
That's true.
peas.
That's true. Yeah.
But yet grasses are this very old family that is of immense importance to humanity, from the use as structure. Bamboo is a grass, and
Exactly.
people have used bamboo for centuries for building, and obviously the cereal crops are grasses primarily. Well, I think exclusively in the technical definition.
They are. Yeah, they're definitely grasses. Yeah.
And then there's the forage grasses as well, and then more recently the biofuel potential
Right.
as well. So if we think about a monk crossing, peas in a garden, it's not quite so simple when you breed grasses.
That's exactly right. It's especially the self-pollinated grasses. We were very fortunate in the forages, though, is that most of our important perennial grasses are outcrossers. So in many cases, so self-incompatible that you can just make crosses by mutual pollinations. In fact, all the work done by Glenn Burton, he would just, this is a famous thing that he produced a lot of his varieties by putting the seed heads in a Coke bottle with water, maybe a little bit of Stolon with them, and just stick them in a Coke bottle and let them pollinate each other and get the seed off. He only needed seed with vegetative propagation. He only needed one plant, So you take advantage of what God gives you, and so we're fortunate. The most important ones are perennials. Anyhow, it's when you move into the annuals, a lot of times you get into self, and the cereals are notorious for that. They have to be. You actually have to be emasculate and pollinate. But thank goodness the cereals flowers get a little bigger than these perennial grasses. So.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And also, though, with perennials, it's not quite as rapid a turnover. And then
That's
the use of it requires some additional evaluation as well.
Exactly. So you can use mating designs on perennials, is what I'm saying, that don't require making crosses, artificial crosses. They'll cross naturally and produce such a small frequency of selves that you get a lot of outcrossing, and then you just start selecting from there. So you can create a lot of diversity just from outcrossing.
But then you want to kind of get that population that results somewhat uniform.
Exactly. Well, uniformity, getting uniformity in all crops has been what plant breeders have always done, getting to some level of uniformity, definitely with the traits, but also with maturity. Just think of the cereals. If you didn't have them all ripen at the same time, you'd be in a heck of a mess, So maturity is probably one of the first things ever done in the cereals was getting them all uniform, So uniformity is important. And we use uniformity, as you know, with your company, that you've got to get through the the certification process. Everything that describes your variety has got to be fairly uniform.
Variety registration and protection,
registration, certification, even patenting. So it becomes very important.
Yeah, if you have a seed field and you're trying to say, this is, and yet you've got this obvious variety of heights and types.
50% off types is not good.
Oh, is that too much? Is that
that might be a tad too much?
Yeah. So one of the thoughts I hear people entertaining, and for whatever reason, is, well, we should just use whatever naturally occurs and that would be best.
Yeah.
So what would be your counter or suggestion for that kind of a thought?
Well, I always try to get a story that goes with it. I remember hearing a story about a farmer who had a beautiful operation and had been, had worked like a slave to get it that way for 30, 40 years, And his preacher came for lunch one day, and he was taking him around, he was admiring his operation, and he just said, "Oh, the good Lord has really blessed you and helped you get this farm." He said, "Yeah, but you should have seen it when the good Lord had it." So, I'm not quite sure. I've been trying to read more about what's going on recently, with regenerative ag and stuff like that. But I'm afraid I'm from the old school, so it's hard for me to get my arms around exactly what they want to do. And maybe I'm misinterpreting what they want to do, but it seems like it's based heavily on low inputs, if no inputs. and using more what's out there, polycultures that are natural out there. So I'm not sure. That kind of goes, maybe it's my training and maybe my bias now, but after 60 or 70 years, that it's inputs are good.
So long as there's a return,
exactly. Exactly.
And show me a man without a point of view, and I'll show you a corpse is one of my lines.
That's a good one. Yeah, I remember that.
But what of certainly in the more eastern, more higher rainfall portion of the United States?
Yes.
How many of the important forage species are native to that part of North America?
Virtually none. I mean, you can if you start counting the grasses like switchgrass, Indian grass, big blue stem, little blue stem, well, they're there. But as far as grasses that are planted and are in very intensive production systems, it's virtually none. It really is. I mean, I don't know if I never have figured out, even though I've released a crabgrass variety. I just never got my hands around it. If this was native or was it? I think it's an African grass, but anyhow, it's very few. Things that we think were weeds at one time and now are grasses.
Well, that's a whole other story for forages, right?
It really is. It really is. It's fascinating, actually.
Is Johnson grass a native?
No.
Kudzu surely isn't.
It's not. I think Johnson grass is a sorghum, so I don't think it's native.
Kentucky bluegrass isn't a native.
I heard it. I used to think it was, but I believe you're right. I don't believe there's a lot of native grasses except some of the range grasses that I've mentioned. And the eastern half of the United States was so wooded. You're talking about these little species that just hug the areas that were just burnt off by fire or whatever, for whatever reason. Yeah.
Right. So I think that many times people have an image of natural, but their time scale isn't long enough to realize that these things have been introduced. There was an ecosystem prior to European settlement, and that ought to inform the conversations. And too frequently, I think it doesn't, just simply because of a lack of awareness.
But, I understand when you go, and that was a great learning experience for me when I was out in Oklahoma, is when you get out into the Great Plains, well, the natives make up a bigger part of what people do and what they use and become very important. And maybe that's the story now, that they're emphasizing that more and more. And I understand it, but I'm just not sure. It's like everything else. When people, make it a faith-based thing, it becomes a little hard for me to get my arms around it sometimes.
Well, but even there, you could still make the case for using introduced species in portions of their system. So we could talk about alfalfa grazing as part of the base that maybe has half or so of native warm seasons, but they're not going to produce in the in the spring or the fall or at times when you need to be resting them. So
the big argument we had at Noble when I was there, I doubt if they have it today, but with the range guys was replanting some of the natives. So whether it was switchgrass or Indian grass or big blue stem, wouldn't it be better to have one that establishes easier and better? You've bred it to be more tolerant of tough conditions to establish. Because one of the problems with those grasses was establishment. I mean, it could take a couple of years to get it where it's contributing. So is that wrong or right? So you're using a native grass, you're just using a different genetic version of it.
Well, and so back to the issue of inputs, and I um, remember you talking about how certainly back in the 70s, and as you were forming your breeding program, your research program, what you didn't, the bottlenecks, filling the bottlenecks, I think was your phrase. And you were coming on at the tail end of when the forage system was grass and nitrogen fertilizer.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. In fact, you know, so I took my first courses in the late 60s and through the 70s. It was just nickel a pound nitrogen. And well, it wasn't quite that expensive. I mean, quite that cheap and by then, but back in the 50s, I mean, I had many a talk with Glenn Burton and you know, the interesting thing about Glenn Burton, who was the foremost grass breeder in the country for many years, is that he started off working on alfalfa. He got his PhD at Rutgers working on alfalfa. In fact, the variety Atlantic came out of a lot of the lines that were in his PhD thesis. So he had a kind of special place in his heart. But you know, I asked him how come he didn't continue to work on alfalfa, and he said Bermuda grass was just tough as nails, and nitrogen was a nickel a pound. So you throw those two things together, persistence, high yield with cheap nitrogen, and man, you could run a lot of cows, you know, and so production, we were focused pretty heavily on production, maybe more too much, but that's the way we were raised, you know. So production is the ultimate issue because it goes to the it affects so much of the economics of you know, for the average producer. Now, I'm
Yield.
not saying that it's be all where all, you know, but it is very important, I think, even today.
Yeah. So for those who haven't been tracking nitrogen price lately, it's what, 8 times that now, or?
Yeah, surely at least 8 times. In fact, I remember back in, you know, there was a big problem in 2006, 2008. We went to $1 a pound for a short period of time. It was, yeah, it zoomed up there. You know,
Now
so
we're farming.
it's tied to energy. You know, it's tied
Yeah.
to energy prices. So, and when natural gas got cheap again, it got cheap. It
Mhm.
got cheaper. It never got
Yeah.
back to a nickel.
So as I'm recalling your when you were talking about filling the bottlenecks, that led you to look at grazing type alfalfas, white clover improvement, and looking to fix a problem with the only cool season grass that you had in Georgia, which was tall fescue. So, what is it about now? Uh, Help me out. Alfalfa originates from the Mesopotamian region,
It does. Yeah.
so I'm not familiar with all the archaeology from there, but the ancient Habines, what were they like there? That
Well, you know, there's stories of the Romans and the Greeks, even as far back there, is carrying it cut and dried, you know, you know, with their horses to feed their horses, you know, and their war horses, you know, and so it was a cut and carry system to them, I think, you know. It was so much a grazing system. They didn't go to plant it. They actually brought it with them, I think, and maybe planted it when they settled. But yeah, it goes way back. I mean, you know, you can see a quote from different Roman, you know, and I love the one from I forgot the guy's name now, but I use it some. You know, it's just if you want more milk, he just says if you want more milk, bring Lucerne to the stalls. It doesn't get more clear than that.
well,
If you feed them Lucerne or alfalfa, they're going to squirt some milk.
yeah,
So they knew that as far back as the
interesting.
ancient Romans. Yeah.
A conversation with a gentleman who's doing research aimed at the low and middle income countries across Africa and into Southwest Asia. And again, the cut and carry is what they practice in part to protect the livestock from everything that's out there. Um, So it just because it comes from back then doesn't mean it couldn't have been a hay crop and there couldn't have been some influence on its development. But certainly in this country, alfalfa hasn't typically been looked at as a grazing crop.
Right. And really backtracking a little bit, like I said, I take great pride in either my wife introducing me or I introduce myself as a grassman. So I realized the importance, especially in the eastern half of the United States, of three major perennial grass species, tall fescue, Bermuda grass, and Bahia grass. I mean, they cover a lot of the landscape, especially in the forage and pasture area. So I knew these would be the base of operation, and that if you want, but they have problems, and that was those problems we tried to attack. So we weren't trying to replace that base, except in the case of tall fescue. We just knew we had to do something about those toxins, and maybe replacement was the only thing you really could do that was effective. I mean, we try other things, and we still do, but I still believe that it's almost like a medical approach. If you can remove a problem without detrimental effects, you should remove the problem. So that's so when we got in, we started looking what are the main problems of these grass systems. Well, the tall fescue was obvious, but Bermuda grass and Bahia grass especially, and even tall fescue at some times of the year have an off season, and also their nutritional value on a straight nutrition standpoint. Well, they're a little low in protein for sure. They can be low, and especially the way we manage them, they can be extremely low in digestible energy and protein. So we tried to pick species that would contribute, and the legumes are important. So we picked alfalfa and we picked white clover, somewhat red clover. And also, as the annuals too became important. I was mostly a perennial man my whole career, except when I was out at Noble. And I have to admit, we started working on crabgrasses and cereals, and so. But it's all to build off this base. That was the whole thing. You're building off a very persistent and dependable base, and that's huge. It's just you got to plug in where the problems are.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, you and I have been familiar with the problem with tall fescue, but I don't know that everyone within the audience is going to be familiar with what the problem is. And I think there's a great story there, not the least of which is the number of graduate programs that were around nitrogen timing on, managing tall fescue before we understood what was going on. So let's just kind of briefly go over the endophyte tall fescue story. Well,
it's really it's a fascinating story. If it didn't have such big impact, it would be a fascinating example of what the mycologists would call mutualism. So you have two organisms, one lives inside the other one, and they both benefit each other. Of course, the plant provides a home, and the endophyte, or it's an endophytic fungus, is what it is. By performing various duties for the plant, produces a series of alkaloids that vary in any way from maybe protection, to there's some growth hormones going on too that gives it more tillering ability. I mean, it's a laundry list of things, but the one that stands out is the ergot alkaloids that give all kind of animal problems. And about the time I was doing this work too, there was a lady who came from somewhere in the Ivy Leagues. I got her book too, and I hadn't looked at it recently, but it's called Poisons of the Past. And her whole thesis was that these type of mycotoxins, whether it's alpha toxins or whether it's ergots, have dictated human history. And she's got some fascinating, indirect stories about, I mean, like in the French Revolution where they ate rye, which can be ergotized, the guillotine was running around the clock during the revolution. But on the coast where they ate wheat, nobody was ever executed because they weren't hepped up on the LSD compounds were coming out. So, but getting back to the main story with fescue, it was great that it provided protection and performance of the variety. In fact, to me, I use the term, and ecologists don't like it, but I think it was more ecologically fit because of all these things it did. It had a fitness in nature, but part of that fitness was anti-herbivory. It used toxins to keep animals from eating it too. So it's it just provided, or it resulted in, especially the way the fescue story went. You took this crop that was so persistent, they didn't know much about it, but they planted it over millions of acres in no time flat. I mean, considering 20 years or so is not a long time to almost get 40 million acres of a crop. I mean, that's unbelievable, especially not an annual crop, so.
One variety.
One variety. It just so happened the variety was toxic. So I remember Warren Thompson used to talk about, he called fescue, he said, really what fescue was in the early days, and Warren lived through those days, so it's interesting to be talking to somebody that actually lived through it. He said it was a gully stopper. People forget that how erosive all that land in those high rainfall areas, that they had taken the cover off the trees and even some of the forage or the crop, or the plants, I should say. And just they started washing away when they were trying to grow tobacco and cotton and all this other stuff. And so fescue was so persistent, and especially Kentucky 31 tall fescue. And that's a story all into itself. And there's a book out now called The Wonder Grass. I don't
yes,
know. Yeah, I'll make a plug for my good old buddy Don Ball there. That's a fascinating book. And if anybody really wants to, the whole history of Kentucky 31, especially tall fescue in the United States, it's a great book. It's a great reference. But, essentially they covered up 40 million acres. It did what it was supposed to do. It covered the land, prevented erosion. But what do you do with land that's covered with grass?
Yeah.
Well, eureka, you graze livestock on it, and then the problems started cropping up, So the plant was doing what it was designed to do. We just were trying to use it differently. And so, all the research was focused on what was the problem. We went through many dead ends, in cul-de-sacs, about what was the problem. And basically it all boiled down to, it's the ergot alkaloid, stupid.
Well,
you could keep the ergots out. You'll probably, it won't totally do it, but it'll mostly do it.
Yeah,
So
your comment earlier about serendipity, because as I'm recalling, I remember Dr. Hovland coming to University of Georgia. That was towards the end of my time there, and talking about a study where, because they hadn't had the drill calibrated properly, they ended up using some old seed to plant one rep. And that led them then to look into what this was. And I think the thing that most of the audience might really enjoy is, it was a very logical progression of thought. First of all, here's a grass that's growing well. Let's develop it as a variety. Look, it's growing really well. They didn't have the ability to know why at that point, in the 30s and 40s. That required some additional technology. And like you say, 40 million acres later, how do we manage this grass so that our cattle perform better? And why is the feed value better than the animal performance indicates? And then we find out, oh, look, there's this fungus that's in these plants, and the animals do poorly. And when it's not in, they don't do, they do better. What's the logical conclusion? Well, we get rid of the fungus. And then what happened?
It didn't hold up quite as well in many situations, unfortunately. Yeah, well managed and stuff like that. In good soils, it would do okay. But you mentioned Hovland. It also, for me personally, that whole time was a series of serendipity events. from me personally. So here I came, 1977. I started at the University of Georgia. There's a guy named Luttrell, Professor Luttrell, who is 2 doors down from me. In the world of mycology, he is a top guy internationally. And who is this student? His student who's working at USDA now? Charles Bacon. So Bacon, I get introduced to Bacon. I also collect a bunch of fescues from South Georgia, and they are persistent. But if I take the endophyte out, because I talked to Bacon, so we were going through that whole era, take the endophyte out. Here comes Hovland, at the university about the same time. It's showing that, that the animal performance is definitely tied to removing the endophyte, or at least removing the toxins. And so we removed the endophyte and it collapsed because we had the stress. We were at the cutting, you look at the North Georgia, South Georgia, you get a pretty quick test of persistence by putting them in these very transitional zones, and then the big thing for me though was going to France, the International Grassland Congress in 1989, and I'm going around seeing, there was the early days of posters, and a guy's giving a poster named Gary Latch from Ag Research. Well, it was DSIR in those days, but on non-toxic endophytes in perennial ryegrass. So the urban legend now, it's in the book. It's almost an urban legend. I'm talking to him and I tell him, and I show him some pictures I brought with me of, how dramatic the death rate was on fungus-free versions of the same genetic material. And I just asked him a blunt question. Do you have tall fescue endophytes that do this? He said, yes, I do. It started from there. Next thing you know, we're doing stuff, and I get down to New Zealand on a sabbatical, and we put a lot of strains and a lot of those ag research strains into our material, and mainly our Jesup cultivar. And you do a lot of animal testing and a lot of safety trials and a lot of agronomic trials, and basically, what we were trying to do was, on the simplistic part, was solve the horns of a dilemma. On one horn, one part of the dilemma is that you wanted the persistence and performance of the agronomic performance of that grass. On the other one, you did not want the toxins. You did not want the animal health problems that came with it. So we wanted to keep one and reduce or eliminate the other. And so by taking the right strain and matching it up, thank God, too, we were so lucky that this wasn't judged to be a genetically engineered approach, because these are naturally occurring strains. It was almost analogous to putting rhizobium on, commercial rhizobium on legume seed, so it was, the regulators just didn't have a problem with it. So that was huge. Looking back now on the whole biotech approach to breeding, that became a huge issue. Because, if you think about it, and that's the way I've always told everybody, this is the closest thing that a breeder gets to a super gene. Putting this organism in the plant is the closest thing they will get to having one gene that does a lot of things. And of course, takes away a lot. So you're keeping the good things. You're keeping, so it does a lot of things on persistence and growth and et cetera, and even insect deterrence. But at the same time, if you can target that one problem and get rid of it, now you've got closest thing to a super gene, really.
And I think I've heard that in New Zealand today, again, they had to, for a while, they had to put up with the animal disorder in order to have persistence in perennial ryegrass, which was their base grass.
Yes.
But now that they have the non-toxic endophyte option, It's essentially looked at as a issue of animal welfare, that there's
Yeah,
no excuse for not using.
it can. We haven't quite gotten there, as you know, in this country, and I know a lot of producers are glad of that. I just know that when we do these trials, and I've done a lot of them, you when you get the point of comparison, it's always the point of comparison for anything. Doesn't matter if it's science or if it's a social issue. You've got to compare it to something. And that when you see those animals with just a polywire fence separating them, and they're on toxic forage versus you realize then how much there can be suffering on certain days, and so it is it if anybody gets out there. I remember my wife, getting back to my wife, she would come to me. She'd go with me sometimes. We were heading toward South Georgia somewhere, and I'd pull into one of the stations there where we had some lamb trials going on, and she saw those poor lambs that were on the toxic, and they would be on 40 million acres of the same stuff. It was everywhere. And she just said, "Man, you better be glad the ASPCA is not is not here." And of course, I'm trying to explain to her in this type of science, we definitely not, it's a control group, so we've got to use them, but we're not going to let them die.
Yeah.
That's but it was pretty enlightening to see that, and very dramatic. And so, yeah, it is. It can become an animal health issue quickly if people observe it. If they just observe it, it's amazing. I know when people see my wife again when we were on a tour in New Zealand, and she got to see ryegrass staggers. She just and of course, as luck would have it, the animal ran into the netted fence, and it was sitting he was sitting there getting not electrocuted, but getting shocked over and over again. It just magnified the whole problem. So you could tell if they fell into a fence like that or into a pond, it could be devastating. So yeah, animal health is probably the best way to look at it. It is. It's a health issue, and the way our society is running now, those are big issues. Yeah.
Um, this goes back a ways now, I'm sorry to say, but 2007, you had a paper on the economic benefits of forage improvement in the United States. So it's my perception, and you certainly should feel free to correct it, but once upon a time, there were far more resources in the land grant and USDA ARS systems for forage breeding, and not so much today.
I would agree with that statement wholeheartedly. Yeah.
And yet, the point can be made for. I like to look at the whole interest in regenerative agriculture as, in a sense, coming aware of what we've been interested in forage agriculture for all along, going back to the people that you've mentioned as being impactful in your life. So the importance of improved forage varieties for the U.S. agriculture, and then and economy, and then we could expand that and look overseas to where many of the same problems exist, and maybe they're just coming to those problems a couple decades after we did, but we're going to be facing those same issues of soil degradation, soil erosion, depletion of nutrients. You mentioned the erosion that took place in Kentucky and Tennessee, and in part that was at the end of a century or so of row cropping without adequate fertilizers and without the sort of practices that we now employ. So looking forward, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about what should we be doing to make sure that there's enough resources available to do this kind of work for the next generation.
Yeah, that is really, it also, these problems just don't happen overnight. It gradually erodes. And so you just start tracking that erosion maybe 20, 30 years ago. I tell students today, even when I go to the seminars or at UGA here, that or meet with them separately, that I was lucky too that I came through a golden era. It was a golden era of funding and a big core group of people involved. I mean, just look in Georgia. I mean, you start talking about guys like Glenn Burton and Wayne Hanna, and there's me up here, so, just, there was a lot of effort going into forage breeding, forage economy, forage agronomy, Hovland. There were legendary guys who were well funded and did a lot of good research, in both sides of both the animal side and the forage side. But if you track that by just number of people, starting say like 2000, it just, maybe even before then, it just starts tracking downhill. And a good example is we had full-time forage extension agronomists. Now, the forage extension agronomist is expected to run 30% of his time doing research, and maybe even has to teach. Well, it's a good use of time, but I'm gonna tell you, they're not gonna get as much out of them for any one of those aspects, research, teaching, or extension, than we used to. So, you give up something to try to get more efficiency, but and the other thing that's happened in forage breeding is the biotechnology approach. And, there's nobody more dangerous than a former evangelist. And I'm afraid, I was an early adopter. I mean, we started doing molecular markers back when Charlie Brummer was here, back in the late 80s, early 90s. And we did the first molecular marker map of alfalfa, so, and I had great visions and when I went to Noble, one of the main reasons I went out there is because I said, we're going to finally get to apply all this biotechnology, whether it's genetic engineering or, genomic approaches or transgenic approaches. And then late in my career, and I wish I knew more about it, is this new thing with CRISPR, and gene editing. That's the big thing now. But what it turned out, though, the only thing I learned about biotechnology is both a user and a manager. I should say, somebody that, especially managing budgets. I'm going to tell you, it always costs more. I can make that flat statement. It's going to cost a heck of a lot of money. And I think, in fact, I wrote a paper recently for my own consumption about is it worth it? And I use an analogy to active versus passive investment, because I'm in retirement now. So it's really interesting to me how IRAs are. Should you be in a passive index fund or should you be in an active manager? And really, it boils down to the fact, if that analogy holds up, that it's the active manager you have to pay. That is the problem. And just what you realize is that now the science providers for biotechnologies, they bring all the experience, and the investors bring all the money. Mm-hmm. At the end, the investors leave with all the experience, and the providers leave with all the money.
That's sort of, that's a version of the father telling his son when he left to, go get some experience.
But some of it worked out pretty well. But, I even got involved ourselves when I was at Noble. We actually have, got heavily involved in the Harvextra alfalfa, the reduced lignin, mm-hmm. and then stacking it with Roundup Ready and stuff like that. So it doesn't mean it can't work. It's just that, and that was really one of the bottom lines of that paper you referenced, is that what it did was, if those things were going to be used, these very expensive processes that had high risk but a high return if you could make it work, especially high margins. You were gonna it was gonna narrow the field for forages. If you were just working in corn, well, that's so everything's corn. But in forages, I make a great point every time I talk. When I first came to the University of Georgia, I could potentially have worked on 28 species. I mean, they were all being used in the state. Of course, like I said, the big three were the main ones being used, but I could have justified any of those, it's in some fashion. So you cannot apply that stuff is not transferable across those species. And then with all the patenting and freedom to operate, it just becomes very difficult. So I think forage breeding and forage improvement in general, the forage breeders had to take that into account, and they just literally could not afford it. So it was like, we're just going to keep driving certain vehicles, and we just can't drive these $200,000 Porsches, and we just can't do it. It's not going to be cost effective.
And I think one of the challenges, and mentioned it back in the breeding and selection conversation, was we're producing a crop that has to be converted into a saleable product.
Exactly. Indirect effect. It's indirect. Our value is indirect. Yeah.
And so there's a big management black box in there.
That's right.
And at the end, then, at least in this country, people like to think of themselves as dairymen or cattlemen or whatever.
You mentioned that black box. Another serendipitous event for me was when I was at the University of Florida in my graduate work. I took my forage courses. I had taken one or two at Mississippi State when I was there, but I took 2 forage courses under Jerry Mott. Now, Mott is a giant, and was a unbelievably interesting guy. And he used to really pick on the breeders or potential breeders, the breeding students in his classes, and he would chide us for not, doing what he called early generation testing under animals. He just called it that. And his position was outside of those 3 species. Bermuda, especially we're in Florida, where we were outside of Pensacola Bahia grass and coastal Bermuda grass. All those species have a problem with persistence, especially grazing persistence. So why don't you take all your populations from the beginning and weed out the ones that are not persistent? Then you can work on things like yield. But he said, y'all do the reverse. You work on aspects, and then you put it out in the pasture, and it collapses. So when I came to the University of Georgia and decided to pick alfalfa as a way to solve problems of those 3 grasses, first person I called was Jerry Mott. And I said, Dr. Mott, what do you think about early generation testing for alfalfa populations to pick the best ones that'll be grazing tolerant? And he said, that's exactly what you need to do. And so, it's again a series of serendipitous events. So next, we went and we found very quickly that you can select alfalfa when you expose it to all the harshness of the grazing environment. You could pick plants that gave you very persistent populations under heavy grazing. And Alfagraze, of course, was the first thing that came out. And I'm telling you, there was a lot of skepticism, from the alfalfa community, as you can imagine. But we had another serendipitous event. We hosted the national alfalfa meetings in Atlanta, Georgia, brought them out to our farms out here, and they saw them head up and how persistent these populations were. And, it was amazing, and the next thing you know, it became more acceptable to look at grazing tolerance. Of course, they want to know, well, what about bloat? Can you get bloat? Next thing you know, you're back. It cycles back. But I have to admit that the quality and a lot of people still graze, and they're not as afraid to graze as they used to be. But again, it was a management problem, and that's what Mott would stress. It was a management problem we were attacking, and that management problem was, how do you keep persistence in these things? Because I don't care how much they yield, if they're not going to be persistent, they're going to have zero yield. no matter how good a quality or yield, how high the yield can be,
And as
So
I recall,
it's another one of those things. But so very fortunate, if you, I mean, I'm just a lucky man, besides marrying above myself. I, I, you know, I was influenced by Jerry Mott, Glenn Burton, Carl Hovland, Roy Blazer, Harold Brown. I mean, just go down the list, I mean, when you're around those type of people, Warren Thompson was a big, a big mentor for me. You know what it is when people have faith in you or have confidence in you, it brings out your best. That's really what happens. Is you probably can look on your own life. People that had confidence in you brought out your best. It makes you think, well, I'm not the same old guy that my high school teachers thought I was.
Thank God.
Yeah, somebody sees something in me. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, a couple things. One is I seem to recall you had to engage some professional consultant when you named your grazing alfalfa variety. That was a really good decision on your part. Well worth it.
It really was. It goes back to marrying above yourself. I'm sitting around here, man, I just don't know how to name this thing. We really want an impactful name. And she just looked at me. It was my wife, Mary Jean, to make the long story short. She said, well, it's alfalfa and it's grazing tolerant. How about Alfagraze? I said, wow. Eureka.
Eureka. Shazam.
That's right. Shazam is probably a better word because I did look like Gomer Pyle.
Golly. So the other point is, and I think it's one of the challenges, benefits, inherent differences about forage agriculture is it's a system. It has to be collaborative. You have to engage with all these other disciplines, and because it's not, and I oversimplify, but if you're going to grow corn, what day are you going to plant it by is going to choose what variety you're going to plant, and then you're going to fertilize it in a certain way, and you're going to do certain operations basically on a calendar, and at the end you're going to harvest it. And yeah, there's more to it than that, Pete. There's far more to it than that with forages. And some of us were fortunate enough to be around when there was a bigger community of scientists involved in forage agriculture, and maybe that's something that affects how we look at other things.
I think it does, and getting back to that question, I kind of got off track there, and I know that's the way these things go, but it really was, like I said, I get back to that golden era. And I'll tell you, and of course, this is what statisticians would say, well, you got one rep and no degrees of freedom for reps. But I remember going to to Southern pasture meetings in Tennessee this would have been in the 80s. Jerry Mott was still alive, so it was definitely in the 80s. He gave a talk. I remember that. Glenn Burton gave a talk. I mean, there were 220 attendees. And that was the peak. I mean, they used to run 100, 150 at each one of those meetings. Now you're lucky. The last time I went to a Southern pasture meeting, they were lucky to get 60 or 70 people. And I think it's a direct result. It's not a direct result of those people. They are very interested and they're good scientists and extension agents and stuff like that. It's the direct thing of how much has been cut back. That to me is a number. So 35 years, we've gone from being able to grab together 200 and something people that would actually call themselves with unabashed, just call themselves foragers, forage agronomists, forage breeders, forage nutritionists, to where now we're lucky to get 50 or 60. So I think that's what's happened, and so when you don't have that core group of people, it gets harder to make progress for sure. But also you cannot you don't have the resources to 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 in a third party situation, especially evaluate some of the things that are coming out, whether it's a product or whether it's an approach. A whole different way to approach the management. You have to take people's advice, or whatever they feel, and so that's one of the problems. I think that for the future is how we're going to, because again, it's a complicated, very diverse systems, and so what do? You narrow down to one crop like alfalfa, and people do a lot of work on that, and so they get more answers than, but you take a crop like crabgrass, they ask people about them, and there's a lot of holes in what you can tell them.
Yeah. Well, okay, so let's end on an up note.
Okay,
at
good.
least I hope so.
I think so. Yeah, we'll try.
Despite that, if we're given the opportunity and the honor to talk to incoming undergraduates or young scientists, and forage agriculture is still critical, and I can make the case for how it's fundamental to achieving development goals worldwide in the next 29 years, which would be these people's professional lifetimes. So what advice could you give someone who is at that stage like you were, where I'll be a forage breeder? Maybe some guidance or thoughts to help them on their path.
I mean, I have to admit that the negatives would weigh me down here, because especially if they're clever kids, they're going to say, but what about this? What about the funding? What about positions? Where are the positions? And rightfully so. So I would have a hard time. I'd have to get on to the fact that that maybe all the new approaches that are more ecologically based, that forages have always straddled both ecological aspects as well as production aspects. And I think in the future, that straddling of both of those things are what's going to make it have another golden era, hopefully. Because where can you go? We work in both worlds. We work in both worlds, because the ecological aspects of forages have always been important. That's why we have so much acreage that's covered in grass. It's because we learned that if we don't, we really have horrible erosion. And yet it's also on land that's not very suitable for doing other things, So you can get some production off of it. So I'm hopeful. And I would point that out. I would point that out to him. It's the only area in agriculture today where you straddle both areas. That you actually can wear both hats and not be, well, there's no doubt you'd be talked down from either side, but I think it is one of the strengths of forage agriculture and forage livestock agriculture, I would say.
I appreciate that. My mind goes in other directions, and this is a complementary argument to that. It's only when economies are sufficiently prosperous that we can afford to worry about environmental issues. And
that is, I agree with that wholeheartately. I think it's our prosperity that's allowed a lot of things to happen. Or at least the way people, especially the political class, is approaching everything now today. If it wasn't for prosperity, we wouldn't be able to take on a lot of these issues, I think, that we do. And but it's an ever-changing world, and it is what it is.
Well, and we look at statistics about where food production needs to be in 2050, or the quality of the food, not just the amount. And and what we're learning about the essential role of animal source food in proper human development and function, and how integrated livestock agriculture and cropping agriculture are. It's only in this country, well, and other maybe Western Europe, where we've seen this specialization to the degree that it exists, but it's still integrated. It's just in different places. And
We have, I'm not plugging Amazon Prime here, but we, during COVID, everybody started streaming things, and we found three things that from the UK. It was from the BBC, I think, where this a historian and two archaeologists went back on three different farms. One was a Tudor farm, so in 1500s, and then one was in the Victorian era, and it was like life on a Victorian farm, life on an Edwardian farm, which was early 1900s. But in all aspects, how important animals were. If you have, and even in the rural South, I overlapped a little bit, my mother definitely did. If you had a cow, a milk cow, chickens, and a few hogs, especially females that would produce litters, I'm telling you, you were in pretty good shape on the protein standpoint. And they knew it, and that's why it was so important. So animal agriculture, if you think about some of the undeveloped parts of the world, a milk cow and some chickens and a hog can carry them a long way. It really can. So I do agree. I think we've taken for granted in the way we look at agriculture and meat and milk, stuff like that, and milk products. We just see the end product and we talk about all the things that are wrong with it. But the inability to get protein and energy is a real problem for some people. Yeah.
And many other nutrients as well, but that's my soapbox that I won't get up on.
Yeah, I know. But if you can't fulfill your protein and energy, you're not going very far.
Somebody said if you're starving, you have one problem.
That's right. That's the only problem you've got. That's exactly right. And I do appreciate what you're doing from that standpoint. I've always found it fascinating when I get to hear you talk or see what you've written. But because I think you take a slant at it that other people, don't keep in mind. It's the old thing. But have you thought about this? And I think you do a good job at that. And that's really what we need to do. But what's the alternative? But have you thought about this? But have you really studied this? Do you realize that you're taking somebody else's word for it? That happens a lot. I'm amazed that when I go back to read source papers, supposed to be the source, how much it's it just goes bananas. I mean, I don't even see what they're saying now as gospel. I don't even see it in the source papers.
Yeah. Indeed. Dr. Bouton, thank you so much for your time. I'm more than happy to answer any questions, although I feel, I don't know if I told you this, I spent the better part of a week traveling around, a colleague driving, and Don Ball and Gary Lacefield were in the pickup truck, and so was I, and it felt like I was back for my oral exam and I hadn't studied enough. So with some trepidation, I'll open myself up to any questions you might have for me.
Well, tell me, just for my own information, I mentioned I try to keep up with what you're doing. What's going on the front that you've opened up on animals and animal products and how worthy they are of our of giving it a higher priority than we do and not talking it down all the time.
Sure. Well, I recommend, and now I'm going to mess up the title. I think it's ALEPH. It's a dynamic white paper, and it's the ethics of meat production and consumption, something along that line, and I'll post the link. and I'll send you the title. It is a collaborative effort. There's 30 some odd researchers worldwide who are contributing to this, and the idea is, again, with a white paper, it's more generally accessible, and then it's thoroughly linked to all the research behind it. And trying to put in one place all this different disciplines work into one place where people can access it. So there's that. I've been paying more and more attention to international work, which is clearly documenting the fact of too little animal source food in the diets of far too many people today. And then that leaves me trying to foster a conversation about, so what do you think the evidence is for too much? Where do you think that comes from? Like you say, if you go and you look at the cited paper and it's like, that's not what they said. Or, this study that was done using this admittedly flawed methodology. They don't talk about that flaw when they make the press release. So we're trying to find ways to work with different people to try to get this information more widely known. There's a couple things that I see coming this year that are concerning. There's a UN Food Systems Summit, which I see having the potential for great mischief. And that's at a whole nother level from what I operate on, but trying to get more and more information out to counter the information that says that livestock agriculture inherently harms the environment and we'd all be better off if we ate less, and et cetera, et cetera. So there's a couple projects along that line where I'm just trying to increase visibility of forage agriculture, ruminant animal agriculture, as well as on the other side of saying there's a whole lot of people who are suffering from metabolic illness, and oh, look, some of those can be reversed through a diet that is higher in animal source food, lower in the processed carbohydrate foods, and people should just try it for themselves and see what happens.
That's I know I'm prolonging this, but that's an issue. I kind of picking up the mantle there. It's one of the dangers I see of emphasis of an agricultural approach where you don't need to do anything. The problem with agriculture to me in my lifetime has been it's so, at least in the United States, it's been so productive that you don't have to do anything. You don't have to do anything. It'll just take care of itself. And that was kind of a political thing. I remember we had the guy from, it was Reagan's science advisor. And, he made a big deal about coming in and saying, there's so many, he told a story that when they asked the ag groups what they needed, they got hundreds of things. Position papers from the oat growers, from the cattlemen. He said you'd go into a room and the tables would be groaning under all this paper from all the different ag groups trying to tell them what they needed. He said, what did the medical people do? AMA sent us a 2-pager. We just need this and this and this, and we need so many $1 billion. We just put it in the budget. He said, so what did we do for ag? The question became, what did we do last year? We just do it again. That was because people, like you said, were not starving. There were very few people starving in this country. I mean, we talk about hunger, but man, we're talking about, back in the day, it was really, truly, you could starve to death. And we've completely eliminated that with modern agriculture in this country. But so there's a tendency for the decision makers, even back in the Reagan administration, to say, well, they're doing fine. Just let them go, And I worry now that complacency is easily attacked oh, we don't really need to do anything. Why are we doing anything? Agriculture will just do its own thing. We don't even need to have government programs and, to support research or whatever. We just do it, let God, like I said, the story I told about the farmer, and, when God had it, it was okay, but it wasn't as productive.
Yeah, there's not a big market for sawbriar, is there?
That's right. You know what my old friend Warren Thompson called that? He called it the 3 S's. Sassafras, what did he call it? It's sassafras, sawbriars, and Simmons.
Simmons. I thought you were going to say sedge for broom sedge. But...
Sassafras, sawbriars, and Simmons. He said that was what a lot of cattle got fed in the early days.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll leave it with one story that I really like that Glenn Burton told. He said when he came to Tifton, Georgia in 1936, he met a guy who told him a story, a cattleman. He said a cattle buyer from New York called a cattle buyer in Georgia and said, I need 200 800-pound steers. And he said the cattle buyer in Georgia wired him back and said, to fulfill your order, I'm going to have to send you 800 200-pound steers. So we've come a long way on fattening up cattle.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
And a lot of that is due to better forages, and a lot of that is due to work that you've done, as well as thank you for reminding me of all these giants. Part of my mission is to make sure that people know all of these people that have been doing this work for generations. It's far too easy and you could pick, it's not unique to forage agriculture, but we too often look at whoever's talking about it today and forget all the people that were their academic advisors and their advisors, and that academic lineage, I think, is worth recognizing and at least paying some respect to.
Appreciate it, Peter, and I really have enjoyed it. I really have, and good luck, and just let me know how things go, and if you need anything else from me, just let me know.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks a lot. We'll talk to you later.